days. Tonight's presentation is brought to you by the Hurley Heritage Society. For almost 50 years, the Society has maintained and operated the Hurley Museum, which continues to be open and free to the public. We're an all-volunteer organization that protects and preserves materials, documents, and artifacts pertaining to the Hurley area and raises awareness and educates the public of the town's special heritage through events, lectures, programs, tours, and community initiatives. We very much welcome the community support through volunteers, donations, and annual contributions. So have you ever wondered about the many unique stones and stone structures in Hurley and the Catskills? I know I have. Large boulders sitting in a field all by itself, or unique rock formations of the Bluestone Forest, and other intriguing outcrops. As a lifelong student of anthropology myself, including a graduate degree that included Native American studies, I find our local Native Americans history fascinating. And by this evening's great turnout, it's clear that many other local people are also quite interested in the subject. Tonight's lecture explores theories on the potential meanings, representations, and placement by Native peoples, including sacred locations and possibly more. Tonight's lecture will be presented by Glenn Kreisberg, an author, outdoor guide, and radio engineer who researches archaeoastronomy and landscape archaeology in the Hudson Valley and Catskill Mountains. His books include Spirits in Stone, Mysteries of the Ancient Past, and Lost Knowledge of the Ancients. He served 2 terms as vice president of the New England Antiquities Research Association and studied archaeoastronomy at SUNY and archaeoacoustics on Malta. He is co-founder of the nonprofit Overlook Mountain Center, overlookmountain.org, in Woodstock, New York, where he lives with his wife and 2 children. Without further ado, welcome, Glenn. Thank you.
Thanks, Riley. Thanks for having me, and thanks for to the Hurley Heritage Society for hosting this event. Really appreciate it. You must have an old version of my bio because my kids are no longer children. They're both pretty much grown up now. It happens very quickly. I am going to share my screen here and give a PowerPoint presentation on this topic. So bear with me here while I get the PowerPoint up and then get it. Let's see here, a slideshow. Let's see, these are the things that always get in the way. The slideshow bar is, here we go, okay. Just bear with me while we get the computer to cooperate from beginning. All right. I'm assuming everybody can see the screen and see the PowerPoint presentation. If not, please let me know. Most of the research that is in this presentation is also published in my book, Spirits in Stone, which Riley mentioned. I don't really think we should be talking about Native American spirit sites or spiritual sites without starting by having a short acknowledgement involving Native Americans and indigenous people, because really all of us, our homes, the schools we send our kids to, the post office we go to, the county and state office buildings, all federal lands, all state lands, whether private or public, are on lands that are and were ancestral lands of indigenous people who, in many cases, gave up those lands against their will through manipulation or violence. So I think that's important to say right off the get-go before we start diving into this. And of course, my daughter, who's 18, would tell me, "Dad, how can you talk about Native Americans? You're not a Native American." And of course, kids today are sometimes too politically correct. And what I tell her is, as long as it's done responsibly and respectfully, people of other cultures can talk about other cultures, Of course, she thinks you have to be Italian to own an Italian restaurant, but that's I'm not going to go there. Anyhow, Manitou Hanasesh translates in Algonquin to spirit stone. Manitou being spirit and Hasanash being Eastern Algonquin, or the way they would say it is, say, the Narragansett in Rhode Island, or Manitou Asanal, which is the way they would say it in Muncie, much closer to where we're from. I'd also like to give a shout out to Doug Harris, who's a wonderful gentleman. He's the retired Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, Deputy Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Narragansett Tribe. And I've done quite a bit of work with him, and he always says, let the landscape speak, which I think is a good axiom for understanding ceremonial landscapes, because it really is a case of letting the landscape speak and understanding what it's saying. I know my camera is glitching out there, and the way the controls are right now, I'm not sure if I see. Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to just blank it out so you don't see me over there. So we are going to be talking about archaeoastronomy and landscape archaeology. Anybody who goes walking in the woods in the Northeast in our area is going to see unusual things in the woods, whether there's old cellar holes or foundations, piles of stones, stone walls. They're all very abundant, unusual boulders set up. And we're not really sure what they are in their proper context. You know, in many cases, they're put in the bucket of early American or colonial constructions, which many of them, of course, are, because there's a lot of that. But there's also a cultural footprint that's here, that was here for 10,000 years before they arrived. Before Europeans arrived, there was a sacred landscape and there was a native civilization here. And in this book, Manitou, by James Maver and Byron Dix, they really made the case that the Native Americans built in stone in the Northeast. And in fact, many of their constructions were aligned with events on the horizon. This would be observational astronomy. Now, Maver and Dix were not lightweights. They were two members of NERA back in the 60s and early 70s. I bought a book on Atlantis by Ignatius Donnelly called The Antediluvian World. And I bought it used and I opened it up and there were a bunch of clippings inside and from the New York Times from 1967. And the story links a find in Santorini in the Mediterranean to Atlantis. This was, this made the New York Times. What was interesting is here's James Maver. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but on the left side, it says James Maver, center. He's down in the hole with the hat, and he's overseeing the excavations at Santorini, both above ground and below ground, based on this find. And it actually made the rounds. This is Wednesday, July 1967. They're talking about this buried city that was discovered and how it's linked to Atlantis. And again, Maver was in charge here. It even made the Sunday edition. So, right now, there's a lot of controversy about science and about pseudoscience. And, when you bring up Atlantis, people put that into the category of pseudoscience. But here you have the New York Times in 1967 treating it, like a pretty legitimate archaeological mystery that's being investigated. So I think that's important to point out. And of course, not just our region, but around the world, we have these examples of archaeoastronomy where things on the horizon and constructions on the ground align, as above, so below. What you have here is Stonehenge. On the upper left, you have Mandajar, which is the oldest still operating solar calendar in the world on the island of Malta. Below, you have a site in Mexico that is I'm forgetting the name of it right now, but it has 12 mounds on the hill there, and it's an archaeoastronomy site. And on the bottom right, you have a chamber in Putnam County, New York, that has an entrance that aligns with the winter solstice sunrise on the shortest day of the year. So this is a phenomenon that's pretty much universal worldwide, that ancient people built constructions and aligned them to events on the horizon. I don't know why there would be an exception in the Northeast, but it's generally not accepted that Native Americans did that. Here's an example of how we might interpret a astronomical site with a viewing point in the middle and landmarks or points on the horizon or point toward the horizon where the sun or moon might rise or set on a particular day of the year. So when we talk about landscape archaeology, here's another picture of the chamber in Putnam County. These are quite amazing. If you haven't had a chance to see these. There are hundreds of them, megalithic, very large, giant stones used on the roof lintels. And again, they're a mystery. We've been down here and toured these with folks from the New York State Museum. In general, they're considered root cellars, but people who know root cellars understand that these would not function as such, although some may have been co-opted in early American and colonial times to act as such. Landscape archaeology and archaeoastronomy. When we talk about landscape, we're really talking about a representation of a living synthesis between people and the land they inhabit. And when we talk about a skyscape, it's a landscape that includes a portion of the sky or horizon from which cultural stories can be constructed. So that's really the connection, the cultural stories and the sites. And if those exist, that's a pretty good argument. The alignments are pretty objective, and we're going to look at some of those as we go along. Here is the problem, and it really comes down to what is being taught in the universities at the time, at the moment, and they're going by Herbert Kraft's book from 2001, a few decades ago. But the standard is there is absolutely no proof that man-made megaliths or dolmens, with or without grave objects, or any other manifestation of old world funerary construction or astronomical alignments exist in Lenape territory in the Northeast. The burden of proof is on those who make such claims, and thus far, every claim has been unsupported by satisfactory scientific evidence. So we're going to talk and try to address that. The case is being made. And it should be made, because if we look at the USET, which is the United Southern and Eastern Tribes Resolution 2007, 037, it reads in part as follows: within the ancestral territories of USET tribes, there exist sacred ceremonial landscapes, stone landscapes, and they're stone constructions which are of particular cultural value to certain members' tribes. For thousands of years, before the immigration of Europeans, the medicine people of the USET tribal ancestors used these sacred landscapes to sustain the people's reliance on Mother Earth and the sacred energies of balance and harmony. Whether these stone structures are massive or small structures, stacked stone rows or effigies, these prayers in stone are often mistaken by archaeologists and state historic preservation officers as the efforts of farm clearing stones for agricultural or walled building purposes. So that's the hill that has to be climbed. But progress has been made, and this was an important conference that took place at Colgate University, hosted by Professor Anthony Avini, and attended by not only folks from the academic community, but also regulators from the State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, the Federal Forest Service, Department of Agriculture, National Forest Service. They all had representatives here, as well as representatives from tribes in the Northeast, like the Narragansett and the Haudenosaunee, the Akwesasne, the Mohawk up near the Canadian border, and even tribes further up in Canada came down for this conference, where they reviewed findings that Lori Rush, you see her name there, she's the cultural resource manager for Fort Drum up in the Adirondacks, and they were doing a project at Fort Drum, and it came to her attention that where they were going to build a fence was going to disturb some stone formations that nobody could really explain. So she started researching it, and as part of a federal effort, she reached out for consultations with local tribal historic preservation offices, and they sent representatives who looked at these and analyzed them and said, you've got a ceremonial site here. So she contacted Anthony Avini, who's really America's premier archaeoastronomer, but he's only done work in Central and South and Mesoamerica, and published dozens of books. But he had no idea that there were these types of things in the Northeast. And quite frankly, neither did the regulators from the state and the federal agencies. They had to admit that none of this was really on their radar. So we're going to look into some of the research I've done in our neck of the woods into, I take a GIS approach. I basically just compile a list of sites, their locations, latitude, longitudes, the different features that they have. And that allows you to filter and to sort and look for different patterns of distribution, of classification, things pop out at you when you're able to look at it in a map. And when I plotted these locations, and you can see another thing is you see concentration. We see the concentration of the chambers down in Dutchess and Putnam and even down in Westchester County, but you also see the sites that are up in our region in the Catskill Mountains and the Shawangunk. And so you can plot them, you can make dots out of them, you can connect the dots. And when I started to connect the dots, I noticed that a lot of these seem to line up on particular bearings. They all kind of parallel one another. Many of them, in fact, all of the ones that seem to be located parallel each other, either from southeast to northwest or from southwest to northeast. Now, on the chart on the left was provided by Professor Curtis Hoffman, who's UMass Bridgewater, and he has a book out called Stone Prayers that covers a lot of this type of research. He's compiled a database, but this is showing that at 42 degrees north latitude from the equator, what you would expect the angles to the solstice summer sunrise, winter solstice sunrise, summer solstice sunset, and of course the equinoxes would both be due east and due west on the vernal autumnal equinox. So this is kind of the sanity check for if these things match up, and they in fact do. And it's not that surprising, because if you start researching other archaeological areas, and this gentleman, Gary David, in his book, The Orion Zone, showed how the Anasazi, the ancestral Hopi, migrated over many generations, always making their encampments, now archaeological sites, along the lines of the solstices. So it's something that's been done for many years, but not necessarily identified in our region. Another fascinating book by David Overson called The Secret Architecture of Our Nation's Capital shows how many of the lines and roads and avenues in DC also conform to solstice alignments. And that was probably intentional. After all, our forefathers and the founding fathers were Masons, Freemasons. Many in the Masonic tradition followed archaeoastronomy and where things lined up, and not just with the sun and the moon, but also with certain stars at different times of year. So again, thinking about archaeoastronomy, so if you were to be, say, 42 degrees north latitude where we are, and you have a solstice sunrise at 57 degrees, if you were to go down to Atlanta, Georgia, that's 10 degrees further south. So instead of 42 degrees, you're at 32 degrees north latitude. Now your angle is going to be, instead of 57 degrees, 47 degrees. So again, depending on where you are, you have to have these angles right to make these alignments. And this again is just pointing out that with the solar minimum and maximum, which is an 18.5 year cycle, takes a lot longer to observe, and the minimums and the maximums are 7 degrees off from the solar alignments on the shortest and longest days of the year, and with the moon rises and moon sets corresponding, but only not in the same spot, but they migrate. And again, just putting that into perspective. Now, this is a chart that a few different researchers compiled and put together. So it's not just Native Americans looking at solstice sunrises and sunsets, moon rises and sunsets, but they're also looking at entrances and exits to the underworld and the sky world. Because in the Native American spirituality, and it's not just Native American, this is in many places around the world. If you go back into antiquity, you do see let's call it a three-dimensional worldview. Their perspective is that there are elements of the underworld and elements of the sky world that affect the world of the living. And there are conduits that go between those worlds. Many times, the medicine people or the shamans perform the ceremonies that allow these portals, for lack of a better word, or conduits, or communication channels to the underworld and the celestial world to be opened, so that energy or communication can take place. So that's a very important element of these sites.
Hey, Glenn, if there's a way you can make the slide, the exhibit sides bigger, then people may be able to see some of these details a little bit more clearly, if possible.
Is it not full screen?
No.
Oh, I apologize.
We can see your notes on the right side, or what the next slide coming up.
Oh, well, then we're not in presentation mode. I apologize. We're not that far in. Let me see. Full screen. It's got to be somewhere here. I thought it was in full screen.
No worries.
I know I get going and it's hard to stop me. Let's.
It looks like Keynote, so I'm not as familiar with that.
Yeah, I don't know. Let's see. Subtitles. It should be a simple way to make it full screen. Of course.
Try display settings.
Display settings at the top center.
I see share at the top center. I see remote control. I'm not.
Taskbar, display settings, and slideshow on your screen.
You're seeing my screen, and you see inside. Yeah, there you go. There you go. Thank you. No, that's not showing full screen.
Right.
That is odd. Pause recording.
Try swapping.
Yeah, let me stop sharing. And let me go back to the PowerPoint and see what that looks like. All right, one more time here, folks.
Better.
Now you're seeing the full screen, and I'm only seeing the presenters mode, and I'm going to talk about the Hammonasset line. Thank you for correcting that, and I apologize. I thought I was seeing, I didn't think you were seeing what I was seeing.
No worries, thank you.
All right, let me make sure I can advance it. That's going to be the other, there we go. Okay, so the Hammonasset line starts down in Montauk, actually at Fort Pond, at an ancient cemetery that is now a modern cemetery. It runs through the state of Connecticut and right up to our region in the Catskills. And it is along that bearing from southeast to northwest of a winter solstice sunrise, summer solstice sunset alignment. All along that line, researchers, including Tom Paul, who rediscovered this line, he lived in Hammonasset and had a property and a site on it, kind of followed it in both directions from his land. And then a bunch of other people started looking along that line to see if there were sites, and many sites were found along it, including the ones you see here that I've documented up in our region. So those are just showing some other burial grounds out there, but this one comes from Montauk, comes into our region, interesting enough, right at what's called the Wall of the Manitou between Catskill Clove and Devil's Kitchen, Platte Cove. It's about a 14-mile escarpment. That's the eastern edge of the Catskills, and this line comes up from Long Island, sites connecting. Basically, I mean, we found sites at Montgomery Place, right on the east bank of the Hudson River, and then we found sites on the west side as well, coming in. And here you can see some of the sites clustered along it. This is Council Rock out on Long Island, where this line, let's call it, this alignment comes from. And if you run it at a bearing of 318 degrees northwest, magnetic, 303 true, it connects on the map with Devil's Tombstone between Phoenicia and Hunter on Route 214, another very large monolith. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And that alignment continues up. If you keep, projecting it on mapping software, it passes through a number of sites through New York State, including Goodyear Lake, which is an important archaeological site. But you see, if we drill in a little deeper right into the Devil's Tombstone, Spruceton Valley area, there are sites that sit right on or very close to this line. And I don't think of it so much as a line as a kind of a swath that comes up across the landscape that sites could be near or right on. And we're going to look at some of these sites. This is a calendar stone up on the trail that leads to the summit of Plateau from Stony Clove. It's my friend Jeff Bear from the Rainbow Lodge. Anybody who saw the paper this week knows the story about the Rainbow Lodge sign that was taken down, a piece of history that luckily was saved and is going to go back up. But what's interesting is this stone, which you would walk by, it's right on the trail, you'd never think twice about it, was reported in the 1981 NERA journal by a gentleman named J. Wilcox, and he documented that there were alignments with this particular stone, including the 303 true summer solstice sunset. Now, just about a quarter mile from this stone, on the very summit, and then when you cross over to the east side, you come across this stone, also quite interesting, a large stone that's got a glyph of the sun inscribed on it. If you do any hiking in the Catskills, this is along the Devil's Path. And as long as I've been going up there, I've noticed this. I didn't really understand what it was until I got to be older, but there is an inscription below it as well. I was never able to make it out until I was up there. You're just seeing how lichenated these inscribed marks are. It's like, generations and generations of lichen growth over it. My guess is this was inscribed well before the DEC trails were created for the hiking system in the Catskills. But it's got a prominent point that's oriented to 136 degrees southeast, which is a winter solstice sunrise. It's basically pointing towards Council Rock down in Long Island. And the inscription, once I was up there when it was winter and I scraped it, I was actually able to make out what it was and write it down. And it's in Latvian, and it reads, the Latvian sun god Sol, NE, northeast. So, why that's up there, who did this is a mystery. I could make some speculative guesses, but that would kind of be wild speculation. Here we show that line coming from Long Island, how it passes through the Catskills and some of the sites that sit right on it. Lewis Hollow, Mink Hollow, Silver Hollow, and there's something to hollows. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But we're getting down on the ground now. We're going to look at these sites and see what you see if you're there on the ground. If you hike into Mink Hollow and through Overlook Mountain Center, we do monthly hikes to these sites. Many of the sites that we're going to cover in the next several minutes are going to be sites we visit. And this is what you see there. A lot of cairns, stacked piles of stone. Let's call them Manitou Hanasash, or spirit stones, because we do believe this is a Native American site. These are pretty regular, about 1 meter high, 1.5 meters, 2 meters across. And you can see they go, in some cases, in a line. There's 4 in a row right there. And some of them are in good shape, and some of them have kind of fallen down. The ones that stand up best are built, like you see here, on a bedrock foundation, piece of bedrock or an erratic that's been dropped out of the glacier. And at some point, somebody piled up a bunch of stones there. And what's interesting here is you have a stone wall tailing away from it, but it's not a very practical stone wall. It's not going to keep sheep or goats, or it's not encompassing a lot. It just, it's what we would call a representation of a serpent or a snake, and that would make it an effigy. And we do believe there are quite a few serpent and snake effigies in the Catskills that have been identified. This wall here runs off in a particular angle, and where that is pointed at the horizon is where the sun comes over the rise on the shortest day of the year. So it's oriented towards a winter solstice sunrise, but it wouldn't be the same angle you would expect on the chart because you don't have a 0 degree horizon. You've got a horizon that might be 10 or 12 degrees above 0. So you have to take that into account when doing your measurements. But I've been there and I did see, although I didn't photograph it, that it is in the direction of the winter solstice sunrise. So looking at this wall, and if you were to compare this to early American or colonial walls, this is a little bit different. This does not have the typical courses, lateral, horizontal leveling that you see typically in European style wall building. This is a little more haphazard. You don't see that neat orderliness to it, but boy, is it well constructed and does it stand the test of time. You would be hard pressed to find a single rock in that wall that is loose or that you could shake. Now, what's also unusual about this wall is you see it's not really a typical wall. Walls have 2 sides. This wall is more like a terrace. The land comes up to one side of it and then it drops down and you have kind of another, level of land below. So, not actually something we would call a stone wall. This one happens to be perfectly oriented north-south, and it actually makes a little bend down about as far as you can see in this picture. It cuts to the right, kind of a dog leg, and points to the spot on the horizon where the sun rises. Also in Mink Hollow, there is a cairn that has a cyst in it, or a small chamber, and in that chamber, when I looked inside on a small pedestal, was a oyster shell. I think that's important to note because you don't find too many things in these cairns. They don't give up their secrets easily. And for there to be this evidence, quite frankly, of an oyster shell speaks to the importance of this site as marking a headwater. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as well, because if you think about the stream that flows out of Mink Hollow, the little Beaverkill that flows to the Esopus and then flows down to the Hudson and out to the ocean. And there were oysters at one point in the Hudson River because it's an estuary. And it seems like somebody found it important enough to bring us an oyster shell up into Mink Hollow at the very headwaters of the Beaverkill and mark it with this. So I think that's important. And as I mentioned, hollows seem to be a place where these sites are found, and we have them in Lewis Hollow, Mink Hollow, Silver Hollow, and it is about the hydrology and where the water comes from, and water being the source of sustenance, where the pure waters come from, not only from in the hollows, are very much like amphitheaters and funnels. They gather the water, as you can see in Lewis Hollow, and bring it all down. But there are also springs in these locations, and the springs flow year round, whether or not the streams dry up, you still have springs. So based on the geography and the hollows and how water is gathered and feeds the creeks that go to the streams, that go to the rivers, that flow to the ocean, it all is connecting. And that's one of the big theories about why these sites are located where they are. So we looked at Mink Hollow. We're going to look at what's up in Silver Hollow. There are mega walls up there that run north, south, and east and west. And here, Dave Holden drew them out and mapped them, showing not only the walls, but some of the unusual features, such as the cairns that are over on the right-hand side. Those are the dots. Some of the places the walls curve, either serpentine-like, like on the right, or where they curve into each other. And you can see these are not small walls. You don't come across walls like this all the time. Over 6 feet tall. There's a boulder there in the top middle that's probably 500 or 600 pounds. In some cases, they're very orderly. In other cases, they've fallen down. Here you can see a graceful curve of an east-west wall into a north-south wall. And here you can see what these cairns look like. They're quite a bit larger than what's in Mink Hollow. They're conical, about 20 feet tall, 20 feet across, and there were about 20 of them. And this is just using one of the apps on my phone showing how the wall aligns pretty much east-west. Now, what I want to point out is able to using the Ulster County Parcel Viewer, you can look at the LiDAR layer. And the LiDAR reveals a lot because you can see the walls and you can see the cairns. You can see them running north and south. You can see the pile. I don't know, I'm not sure if you see my cursor, but a circular pile towards the center there. Zoom in, you can see a circular pile or a circular arrangement of piles to the right of that wall. And if you look off to the right, you can see some other constructions in the woods that I highlighted here because they run perfectly east-west, and they are running from Mink Hollow across into Silver Hollow, into this site that we were just looking at. So LiDAR can be a really important tool for understanding what we're seeing on the landscape. In Silver Hollow, there's also a cyst cairn. There was nothing in this one, but it was oriented towards a particular direction that I think was significant. Another cairn there. Moving over to Bearsville Hollow in Woodstock, there are a few dozen cairns here within stone walls that enclose them, so perhaps a sacred precinct. What you have going on here are what we call turtle cairns. And when you look at them, you can understand why some people associate them with turtles. There's usually a large stone near the base that is tucked in and that the rest of the cairn is built around. And some people might say that's just happenstance, but when you start looking at enough of them and you see all those, all of them have a one prominent large stone down near the base, like the head tucked in, to me, we're seeing representations of turtles. And that shouldn't necessarily be so surprising, because turtle is like the March of the Turtles. They're coming right at us here. The turtle was an important spiritual character, in an element in Native American mythology and spirituality. When you talk about the creation myth of Native Americans, they almost all involve turtles. And North America, of course, is referred to as Turtle Island. And that is because of the creation myth that involves a worldwide flood, and something that's not just unique to Native American ancient mythology, but we see that worldwide. So there is a flood, and an animal is sent down by the creator to the bottom of the body of water and comes back up with a clump of dirt. Sometimes it's a beaver, sometimes it's a muskrat. So different animals can be in that role of gathering the earth from the bottom of the water, but it brings it to the surface and places it on the back of the turtle. And it repeats that process over and over until you have a landmass that people can live on. And that's the myth, the creation myth of many tribes of Native American that involves the turtle and Turtle Island or North America. So we see them in other places. The one in Bearsville, all those turtles, turtle effigy mounds are built around this central effigy, which I don't believe is man-made, but I think it's a natural feature that was identified by Native tribes that were in our area. And I think they would come into an area and they would survey it and look for any features, any prominent natural features that they could incorporate into their belief system and into their worldview, into how they would express it. And coming across this, they, I believe, would relate it to a turtle and thus make it a ceremony site and build these cairns that we find around it. And of course, turtle cairns, as I say, are not unique to Bearsville. We find them in Connecticut. We find them in Spruceton Valley. We also find serpent effigies quite common at different sites, including up on Lewis Hollow and in Westkill. And we'll look a little more closely at those sites as we conclude here. Halcott Mountain is a site on the border of Greene County and Ulster County on Route 42 as you travel through towards Lexington from Shandaken. It's the headwaters of the Bushnell Kill. Of course, kill in Dutch means stream, and Bushnell is the town, Bushnellville. So you have the Bushnellville Kill. It's a mouthful, and it runs out of Halcott Mountain, I should say, and down into the Esopus, and it's its own watershed, I should say, because it's important also to understand that Native Americans didn't necessarily see the stream or the river as a border the way we do. Many of our states, border rivers, and on one side of the river, it's one state, on the other side, it's another state. They very much operated under, the watershed, understanding all the land that was connected to that particular body of water or stream or pond or river. Now in Halcott, you've got these cairns that are built right on springs that flow off the hillside here. You can see that the water comes right out from underneath this cairn. Behind it is dry on the hill, but in front of it and beneath it, the water is pluming out. And you have a hillside here that's basically covered with greenery and springs. And this is actually early spring, and it's almost like a carpet of green coming down this hillside, surrounding these carpets, these cairns, because of the springs and the moisture that are permeating up from the groundwater. And many believe that these sites do in fact mark where underground aquifers and springs can contribute to the streams and creeks. Also in Halcott, you've got this beautiful serpentine wall that flows through the woods, doesn't really serve any purpose, is right next to all the cairns we were just looking at. And this in fact is a double wall, in that it's the way it's constructed is there are two walls built parallel to each other, and then they're filled with debris or rubble in between. This is not, again, typical construction of what you would see from a Eurocentric wall builder. It does not have that orderly lateral horizontal courses of stone that or that straight running line, as you can see in this serpentine image. So serpent effigies were very, very much a thing at Native American ceremonial sites. And it's because they're an element of the underworld. All right, from Halcott, we're going to just go a few miles down the road to Westkill and the Spruceton Valley site at the end of Spruceton Valley Road. And this is also along the Hammonasset line. This is a wonderful site. It's got large cairns. It's off trail, so you wouldn't really see it unless you knew where to look. And these are beautifully formed. Many of them also have the turtle configuration to them. This one, is very hard not to see a turtle once you're looking for a turtle. This one as well. And the Westkill is a stream that flows to the west where the sun sets. And this site is oriented to the west. It's got niches that, nothing has been found in these, but I always imagine them as places where offerings can be left. This one has either collapsed or somebody dug into it, trying to find out if it held any secrets or treasure. Just was a common thing that happened in the early 20th century. You had pottery shard hunters and artifact hunters. And if they knew of these sites, sometimes they'd get dug into and disturbed. And it's hard to say if that's what happened here, but that one obviously has been messed up. This one has another niche with nothing in it. But if you're here on the solstice, there are also walls at Westkill and the Spruceton Valley site that run east-west, but not perfectly, because they're actually aligned with where the sun sets in the west on the solstice. And you can see some of these stones are quite large, hundreds of pounds. And you also have cairns that are aligned in a row. And again, not perfectly east-west, but lining up with where the sun sets. And I do have an image here of one of these events, a light phenomenon where the sun is setting in the west on the summer solstice. And there's a pile there that's got a stone that aligns with a top stone that aligns with where the sun is. And we're going to see more evidence that supports that same concept. We're going to head over now to Mohonk on the Shawangunk Ridge, and behind Skytop is Lily Pond, and next to Lily Pond is this, what I call the Lily Pond stone. Somebody sent this to me, a picture of it, because they know I like looking at big stones in the woods. And I was up there with some friends on the solstice, and we noticed that the sun was setting and sending a shaft of light right at the base of this stone. This is about 7:30 on like December, oh yeah, it's there on the bottom, December 21st, 2017. I believe that's the leg of my friend Jim Munson. And he said, look at that, there's a glow hole projected from that shaft of light on the base underneath the stone. What are the chances of that? And so this light projection really only shows up there on the eve of the summer solstice sunset, when that shaft of light projects through the base of the stone and creates this little illuminated triangle. Why would people do that, and when would they have done that? You can only really speculate. Here I put the compass on it and showed that it is at the bearing of the summer solstice sunrise, winter solstice sunset, or that would be summer solstice sunset. I apologize. But why would people do that? And who would they? Who would they be? And to me, maybe it speaks to the very first people who came into the area. And who were those people? And where did they come from? And if you talk to the archaeologists, and I want to say it was about a year ago today that Dr. Diamond from SUNY New Paltz gave his talk on Native Americans in the Esopus Valley. But even Joe would say that the years that humans first showed up in the Hudson Valley has been getting pushed back further and further and further. And where we used to think it might be 7,500 years ago, now maybe 9,500 or 9,500 BC, 12,000 years ago. It keeps getting pushed back further and further, not just people in the Hudson Valley, but people in America. And it's not a settled question. The evidence suggests, between 17 and 23,000 years ago, people made their way into America. And I don't doubt that some of them found their way to the Northeast, and that they were a coastal maritime culture coming from Northwest Europe. And there's a theory that's known as the Solutrean theory by Dennis Stanford of the Smithsonian. He's no longer alive, but his partner Bruce Bradley wrote a book called Across the Atlantic Ice. And they postulated that the peopling of America first happened from Europe on boats following the ice at the end of the last ice age. So if those people made their way into the interiors, like areas like Skytop or the Hudson Valley, they would have brought with them a lot of skills, a lot of knowledge, and a very, very well-established and sophisticated belief system that quite possibly would have involved sun worship, if not also fertility or goddess worship, which are some of the earliest forms of human religion or worship around the world. We're still in the Shawangunk and the Mohonk Preserve, and this is Montague Crag, and this has another solar alignment we're going to look at. We're at the summit, and I've been up there many, many times. And it wasn't until I was up there with my friend Ian, and he was sitting there having lunch against a rock, and I said, you know, it looks like that rock's been shifted. It looks like it's been moved. And sure enough, this rock has been moved in its position in the bedrock, and it's been moved in a very particular fashion. And you can see that point on the left that was once flush up to that line on the bottom was shifted. And it's also a very triangular rock. You can see where the original edge above the point of the arrow lined up with the face of the rock, and you can even see where the lichen has changed since the rocks moved. And quite frankly, the whole top of Montague Crag is covered with ancient lichen, generations of lichen growth on top of lichen growth, and there's very little area that is not covered with lichen. So where was the rock shifted to point? And here you can see its position shifted in the bedrock, and where that point is now oriented towards the horizon. And the only way to really confirm that it's a summer solstice sunrise, other than putting a compass on it and seeing that it matches Curtis Hoffman's chart, is to go up there at 6:50 on June 21st and notice that we do have a true alignment with the sun rising on the longest day of the year with where that rock was shifted to. So when it was shifted, who shifted it, I couldn't say, but why it was shifted, I think it was shifted to memorialize and create a calendar event on the shortest day of the year, the winter solstice. So we see that in other areas, and we're going to look at one more stone just a bit north. I think what I'm showing you here, I don't know if you can make out the writing, but you have the Shawangunk Ridge, and you have the Montague Summit Stone, and you have the what's called the North Shawangunk Dolmen, which is what we're going to look at next. It's just about a mile north of Montague on the ridge top. And this is an interesting stone that's set on 3 base stones at a particular angle. Geologists would tell you that it slid out of the glacier and placed itself this way by happenstance. And we definitely know that if you walk on the top of the ridge in the Shawangunks, there's tons of evidence of glaciations. The last glacier maximum, and when glaciers were receding, they scoured the top, and you can see glacier polish and glaciers scoring all over the place. So the glaciers were there, but whether they dropped this stone or moved this stone, I believe people came along at some point and set it up in this particular fashion with a very prominent north point, west point, and east point. And when I gave this talk, several years ago for the New York State Archaeological Association, some people kind of scoffed that people could move a stone this big. And before I could say anything, David Johnson, who's the chapter president of the Orange County chapter of the New York State Archaeological Association, he jumped up to my defense, and he was like, "Are you saying people couldn't have moved a stone this big?" Because of course we know stones this size and far, far greater were moved by humans in antiquity. And if there's a will, there's a way. If they had a reason and a purpose to move this, people, and certainly the indigenous ancient people of our region were, smart enough, ingenious enough, to come up with a way to move it if they so wanted to express their beliefs. And I think that's what you have going on here, because this particular boulder is aligned again at that very exact 318-degree angle with this rock up in Pikamusk, known as Reconnoiter Rock. that also is a bit of a compass stone. So compass stone, calendar stone, these things work as both. And in fact, I think they may be geodetic or geodesic markers. The one up in Picamous, known as Reconnoiter Rock, is on the shoulder of Picamous or Table Rock. From this angle, I think it has a very avian aspect to it. It looks almost bird-like. But as you see, the North Shawangunk Dolmen and the Picamous Perched Rock have line of sight. There's nothing obstructing them. If you had a fire burning, a signal fire burning at one early in the morning before sunrise, you would see it from the other location. It's only 18 miles away across the Rondout Valley. But it is at that angle. You can see 317.6, so I'll say that's close enough to magnetic winter solstice sunrise, summer solstice sunset azimuths. Now, could Native Americans have run straight lines like that through the woods, line of sight or not line of sight? You know, there's no evidence to suggest that they could, or is there? And this wonderful drawing was provided to me by Thomas Brannan. He's quite old now. He lives down in Middletown. He's probably 90. And these are his notes on this picture of a Delaware family. Now, he was he was a civil engineer before he retired, and he was a land surveyor for his entire career. And what he saw here was a surveying team. All these notes, the numbers and the notes and the circles are his notes. And he's saying this is a sighting staff with, for measuring height, and that you have pendants that they're wearing around their neck that have gradients on them that are also could be held up in front of your eye to look through and to line up. And he believed we were looking at a Lenape survey party here. Now, whether they had this skill all along or whether they have acquired this from Europeans, you know, this is 1653, so there were Europeans around. But I don't think, as anthropologists and archaeologists who look at this drawing say everything you see is ornamental. There's no practical purpose to that staff having equal size gradients or there being a cup at the top of it. You know, they would say this is just an ornamental representation of a peace pipe, or, you know, or a design as far as the pendants. And even the young one has a pendant, so maybe he's getting trained or turned into it. So I do believe they could run straight lines across territory if they wanted to. This is just showing the, I believe that's the North Shawangunk Dolmen, and it's line up with the Picamous Reconnoiter Rock. And then if we look at the Bonteque Summit Stone, just a little bit south, it actually lines up with the site in Frost Valley, where there are petroglyphs that have been found out by the YMCA up there in the stream. And again, these are things that are on our landscape that a lot of times they get ignored. Here is another boulder. It's easy to walk by and just think, oh, this, you know, just again settled out of the glacier. But it is on a summit ridgetop. It's got 360-degree views in all directions, and it actually has cardinal directions built into it. If you put the compass on these major points, you can see this is a north point, this is a south point, and this is a west point. So another compass stone oriented to the cardinal directions. I think that's very telling. So we're going to move now down to a rock, a site down in Plattekill, which has this amazing turtle effigy here. And it's called Turtle Rock Ridge on Marlborough Mountain, just a few miles west of the Hudson and north of Newburgh Bay. And this, you know, whether humans did this or nature did this, it's just an amazing effigy of a turtle. Again, I mentioned before, turtle effigies are very prominent in Native spirituality. And there's no way to look at this and not see a turtle effigy. This also has a light phenomenon that takes place on the equinox at sunset. You have this little grotto behind the head of the turtle that captures the light, another glow hole as the sun is setting. It just shines into that little niche and illuminates it. So I think that's very, very telling. At the same site on Marlborough Mountain, there's a sun glyph that I've highlighted here. There's also a portal that does look down on the Hudson River and also is in the direction of the winter solstice sunrise to the southeast and oriented towards that point in Long Island. There's also these interesting, this is also under the turtle, there are inscriptions. Somebody interpreted this as two comets falling. You can see circles with tails leading them away from them. And it makes you kind of wonder whether this might be a representation of a cometary event, something happening in the sky. We know that there was an event that took place 10 or 12,000 years ago, known as the Younger Dryas Impact Event, which is a hypothesis for a period of climate change that happened worldwide. And they believe that it could be connected to an impact that happened in the Northeast around that time, 10,000 years ago, or 12,000 years back BC. Also a cross-hatching inscription down there, which I'm not really sure what that means, but it looks very old. And we've seen that in other places as well, maybe related to a calendar, but hard to say. Also, there are other turtle effigies up there. This is another rock. And that's showing the position. Only got a few more sites here, then we'll be wrapping up. That's showing the position of Turtle Rock on Marlborough Mountain, about 4 miles west of the Hudson River on the west bank. And it's going to lead us into another site, which is Danskammer Point, which is located right on the Hudson River. And when I started researching this, its orientation to the mouth of the Wappingers Creek jumped out at me. Now, of course, it's called Danskammer's Point because when Danskammer is Dutch for dance chamber, and this was originally called the Devil's Dance Chamber because as the Native Americans were performing a ceremony on that land in 1609, a ship happened to sail by called the Half Moon with Henry Hudson on it, and his crew marked in the log that this ceremony was taking place. And because all good Dutch Calvinists considered Native Americans devil worshippers, they named the place Devil's Dance Chamber. And a lot of prominent areas of the Catskills are known as Devil's this or Devil's that, Devil's Kitchen, Devil's Acre, Devil's Tombstone. I think that's a pretty good indication that the Europeans who gave it that name recognized that there was some kind of Native American religious activity taking place there. It's unfortunate that they interpreted it in the context of devil worship, but it is a clue that it was probably something that indicated ceremonial activity. So here we see how the point of Danskammer lines right up at the mouth of the creek. And it also corresponds and correlates with Curtis Hoffman's chart. And using Google Earth, I was really able to illustrate this by showing that from the point of land to the mouth of the creek, there you can see 57 degrees is the heading. And the top left, you can see it's June 21st at 5 a.m. And as or 5:23, as the sun comes up, it aligns with where the point of land at Danskammer is lining up with the mouth of the Wappingers Creek. Now, in the evening of the same night, the summer solstice, you have from that same point of land over the creek, you have the rise of Pleiades also on the horizon. So to me, that's an important correspondence. And I started researching that to understand whether the summer solstice sunrise and the rise of Pleiades, if there is a conjunction, and in fact there is, and it's been reported. And there's a professor of anthropology at Harvard University named Gary Urton, U-R-T-O-N. Unfortunately, he's fallen out of favor because he had inappropriate relations with his students, which lost him his position as the chair of anthropology at Harvard a couple of years ago. And Urton, he was best known for having interpreted Incan knots as being an alphabet. In textiles down in South America, there were these knotted textiles that for years people, again, the experts considered to be only ornamental. But about 20 years ago, he realized that the knots each represented a different symbol. And if you put them all together and decipher them, there's actually a code of communication that's in the textiles. And his students for quite a few years were following up on that research. And there is some really solid research involving that, and also involving the astronomy of the Incans. And they absolutely, through Urton's research, was able to confirm that there is a conjunction between the summer solstice sunrise and the rise of Pleiades on the longest day of the year. So thinking about that, and also looking at Urton's research, he suggested, because he looked at my research, and this was several years ago before he had a fall from grace. And it was very confirming, because he said, look in the other direction as well, because when you see a winter solstice or a summer solstice sunrise, the reciprocal will be a winter solstice sunset. So of course, from the mouth of the creek over the point of land, you do have a winter solstice sunset. And there you can see in the upper left, it's 12:21, December 21st, the solstice, and in the evening at 5:20, you have the sun setting aligned with where the mouth of the creek and the point of land line up. And then again, based on his research, he said, look for a galactic alignment in the same place. And sure enough, when I forwarded the Google Earth tool later in that evening of the winter solstice sunset, you do have a galactic alignment where the Milky Way comes down and meets the horizon vertically, which does not happen often and is notable. So I think all this evidence at Dan's camera point really speaks to the Native Americans having recognized this place for that reason. If you want to understand why they were having their ceremony when Hudson sailed up the river in early September, and most likely it was the corn festival, or the early green corn festival. They probably had been doing so for generations and generations, and he just happened by that evening. And this was probably a important spiritual site because of its relationship with the creek across the river and the sky and the stars. And it's just terrible that Central Hudson made it into a power plant in the 1930s, but that's the realities. The last site we're really going to look at here is the Lewis Hollow site, my home site up on Overlook Mountain here in Woodstock. And this site has really been very well researched, as we're going to look at here. We know that Native Americans were there going back at least 2000 BC, so 4,000 years, rock shelters where they were preparing for winter. And we also know that there was bluestone quarrying that was done there. And it's really a serial use site, as many of these sites are, that Europeans have come into and put their footprint on top of the native footprint. And their cultural footprints, one on top of the other, from your early European exploring and subdivisions, like the Hardenberg Patent and the Livingston Land subdivisions. That there was a lot of lumber taken. There was the glass industry in Woodstock that took place on the backside of Overlook Mountain, accounting for Glasgow Turnpike and artesian glass. And there are interesting stories behind that as well. And of course, you have the bluestone quarrying and the documented Irish village where the quarry workers worked and lived up in Lewis Hollow. And today you have modern homes. And what's not on this list, of course, is the Catskill tourist industry that took place in the late 19th and earliest 20th century, with large mountain houses and people who were employed working in those, and guests who came in. Now, the Lewis Hollow site, we had a GIS survey conducted by Susan Sweeney, who's the specialist at the New York State Museum. She's an archaeologist in GIS. And she sent this to me like 10 years ago and said, here, I plotted everything out. You've got large cairns, 6 of them. You can see the large red dots. You've got 2 of these snake serpent effigies up high at about 1,100 feet. You've got a couple of springs, and you've got dozens of these smaller cairns. And what I did was, based on a suggestion from my friend David Holden, he said, maybe there's a constellation being depicted. And I thought, well, there's way too many, and you could cherry pick, and you could probably draw all kinds of patterns. But I focused on the 8 large objects up there. So each of the 6 great cairns are between, the blue dots are between 60 and 100 feet in length. And the 2 serpent effigy walls up at the top are each about 90 feet long. Everything else is much, much smaller. So those, those jumped out at me, and I decided to see if David was right, and maybe there was some kind of correlation with the constellation. I was kind of skeptical, but I drew those out. I connected the dots in the only way possible. laid them out on the topo map. You can see where they are. And what we're going to do now is look at what they look like on the ground. So there on the top right is a serpent effigy wall, a great cairn on the bottom. There's 3 of them there, and they're labeled, Great Cairn 2, Great Cairn 3. Here's what the serpent wall looks like, front and back. There are 2 of them. They're pretty much identical, tails towards each other, heads away. One of them is in very good shape, but another one is very broken down and decrepit. Now, a lot of common features of these walls are they have these retaining walls on the downslope side. And those would help prevent gravity from destroying these things and pulling them down over time. So the retaining wall, I think, was an important feature. It allowed the rock to be built up on top of them, higher than the wall, but also prevented gravity from pulling them down. Now, when I was looking to investigate whether this was in fact a constellation, I found out there were other representation on the Earth that are reflections of constellations, but they're just that, reflections. So you have to kind of swap it. And that's what I did. When I flipped it and I looked at the constellations in the Northern Hemisphere, there was really only one that came close, and it was Draco, which happens to be the serpent or the snake effigy, serpent or snake constellation. I didn't really know anything about Draco until I made this connection and I started investigating it. But I was really surprised how close the configuration of the constructions on Overlook matched to the constellation Draco in the night sky. And you can see right there, it's a pretty close correlation. And what I did on the left was I just put the stars of Draco, I labeled them on the constructions on the mountain. So kind of matched them up one for one. Now, there are, as I mentioned, other constructions on the ground that are considered petroglyphs or petroforms that mirror constellations, including Draco. And in Graham Hancock's book, Heaven's Mirror, one of his associates documented how Angkor Wat on Cambodia, in fact, mirrors Draco. So on the bottom is the construction locations of the temples in Cambodia, and on the top is what Draco looks like. So they believe the ancient Kamaru were, in fact, creating a construction that matched something in the sky. Another gentleman named Herman Bender created this stickman petroform in Wisconsin that represents both Scorpius and Leo, as well as a human figure. And a gentleman down in Georgia named Lee Pennington, he identified this representation of Draco as well as the Big and Little Dipper in walls constructed in the woods of Georgia. And also the Serpent Mound in Ohio has been said to have a portion of it that corresponds or lines up with parts of the constellation as Draco as well. So it's not just in our area, but in other regions, this phenomenon has been mapped. David Johnson, who I mentioned earlier, he found a representation in New Hampshire of what he believes is the Big Dipper, also marked with great cairns. So this is something that I think needs to be pointed out. Now, if you take the coordinates of the site on Overlook Mountain and plug them into astronomy software like Stellarium, what you'll see is that constellation Draco is actually in the sky, is actually in the sky above Overlook Mountain, circling around the point that's known as celestial north. So celestial north is the point in the sky where the Earth's axis points to. And it's not a fixed point. It moves over time. It moves over a 26,000 year cycle known as the precession of the equinox. And that's because our planet is tilted and is wobbling. And because it's tilted and because it wobbles, the point of celestial north scribes a slow circle in the sky of 26,000 years. And I'm just going to fast forward through a few of these here. A gentleman named Mark Carlotto did a statistical analysis of how close the petroform on Overlook of Draco matches to the sky configuration of the constellation. And he ran the numbers and found a little over 82% match. And he said that's actually one of the higher correlations between the matches of petroforms on the ground and constellations in the sky. Because if you're thinking you're a group of people and you want to go ahead and create something on this ground that reflects what's in the sky, as above, so below, how accurately can you actually do that if you don't have, expert modern tools? And, to get it 100% would be miraculous. Getting it at 82%, I think, is pretty impressive. So Carlotto, who's a statistician and a aerospace engineer, does a lot of work with NASA. He has looked at this and found that there is a pretty close correlation. Now, Draco, which I didn't know anything about, it turns out is a very prominent constellation in the northern hemisphere because it is circumpolar, and it was identified by the ancient Chinese and the ancient Greek, who referred to precession of the equinox as the great year, that 26,000-year cycle. But also the Persians and the Celts and the Norse all identified the serpent or the snake effigy. They didn't all call it Draco, it's a Latin term, but they did understand it to be a serpent in the sky, and its circumpolar configuration having always circled around that point in the sky where celestial north is, marked today by the star Polaris, which is the closest star to that location in the sky. But over time, sometimes there are no stars close to that point of celestial north. But in the past, it was actually Thuban, the third star in the tail of Draco, that was our pole star for thousands of years ago. The Great Pyramids of Egypt, there's a shaft that leads from the king's chamber to the surface of the pyramid that today is aligned with nothing, but when it was constructed, it was aligned with the star Thuban, appeared in that shaft because it was the pole star at the time. So a lot of really interesting mythology is tied to that pre-Christian mythology. When we talk about the shaft or the tree of life, it could be seen as the axis of the earth. And when we talk about the serpent always coiled around it, it could be seen as the constellation Draco, always marking or helping mark that point in the sky of celestial north. And we could see Overlook Mountain as being perhaps a beacon for any people living in its viewshed for where celestial north is. Now, wrapping up here, we're going to look at some OSL dating that took place at Lewis Hollow in the last couple of years by Dr. James Feathers of University of Washington and Drs. Maureen Florin and Vesna Kundik from Stony Brook. They came out and they did OSL sample taking, and this was sponsored by NERA, which I'm a member of. And what they dug was they dug down through these shelters underneath and took rocks and sediments that were sent back to the lab. And what they can determine is the last time sunlight shone on the minerals that are within the sediments. And inside these stones and these sediments are minerals of quartz and feldspar, and they go in these collection cocoons and they dig down and they retrieve and they mark the depth and they take all their readings, and they actually leave a little dosimeter there, which gets buried and then retrieved after a year. And that dosimeter has a little bromide in it that reacts very differently to sunlight once it's buried. And you retrieve it exactly a year later and you send it back to the lab, and they use that to help calibrate the dating. And so it all has to be gathered in the dark, and it has to be packaged in opaque packaging. These are a couple videos. I don't think they're going to play. They don't usually play on Zoom, but it's basically showing the process of covering these up, because they go in with their headlamps on, and there's about 7 layers of carps before they say they can see no light penetrating, and then they can start doing the digging to retrieve the samples that can have no sunlight shining on them until they get back into the lab. So what we had, and by the way, Dr. Feathers' a paper was published, peer-reviewed and published just a few months ago. So here's a reference to that. I don't know that it's free. You might have to hit a paywall to actually download the entire paper, but what it determined was that our 2 sites that were sampled in Lewis Hollow produced dates of 1510 plus or minus and 1690. So these are tantalizing results in that they are, well, 1510 is surely pre-contact, and so that tells you these are Native American. 1590 is a few generations later. So that tells you that, this construction process was taking place over quite a few years, hundreds of years. And we know there are dozens of features in Lewis Hollow that have not been dated. So, what we'd like to do is eventually date all of them, so we have a chronology, and we can figure out if 1690 or 1510 are towards the later part, or if everything was built within several hundred years, or if any of these features might go back a few thousand years. NERA and Dr. Feathers sampled dozens of sites in the Northeast, and it takes a few years to get results because of that dosimeter. But the results that have come back and that are published in that paper indicate that some of these sites are between 2500 BC and contact. So it's a wide-ranging date. The site in Lewis Hollow is currently being used by the Ramapo Lenape Munsee Turtle Clan. There's Chief Vincent Man at the top there. They come up on these winter solstice and do their ceremony. They start a fire with no matches or lighter at 10 degrees and lay out their accoutrements on their altar and do their ceremony. And I was honored to be there for this a few years ago, and that they've accepted the site as a Native American ceremonial site and use it today tells you the importance of it. And it's important on many, many levels. And what I'm going to end up talking about as I conclude here is our local town of Hurley. And by the way, I grew up and lived my whole life in Hurley. I probably should have mentioned that at the beginning. And this was on Indigenous Peoples Day just a few months ago, and Chief Man and his wife, Nicolina, who happens to be the tribal preservation officer for the Turtle Clan of the Ramapo, they came up because Peter Humphreys, one of the town councilmen, had pointed out a rock in the woods at Dug Hill that he thought Chief Man should come and look at. And they were very impressed with the stone. And what we found out about it is it's actually at the highest point of Dug Hill. Where we walked to this land, to the spot, everything fell away in all directions. It was, when I looked at the topo map, it turned out that this spot was the top of Dug Hill. So it was marked. Whether it was marked in antiquity and who and when, that's an open question, but there is a stone there. On the front of it are striations. We saw something similar at the Turtle Rock site in Marlborough. Now, I'm not saying that a bulldozer bucket could have done that and tipped this thing upright 70 or 100 years ago. But it also could be a Native American ceremonial feature, and we can't just dismiss it. So there is a new paradigm that's emerging. And a lot of the research you saw in this presentation was presented to Dr. William Romaine, and his response was, "It's clear to me that the Northeast has been totally and inappropriately marginalized by the mainstream. The Northeast US is right up there with the Southwest, Midwest, effigy mounds, lower Mississippi Valley, and other traditions in terms of archaeoastronomical alignments, sensitivity to landscape features, and cosmological understandings." When I attended Dr. Diamond's talk a year ago, at the end, I asked him about these sites, and he unequivocally dismissed them and said they are not, and there is no such thing as ceremonial landscapes in our region. Now, and quite honestly, I've searched and researched this topic for almost 20 years, and I've done searches, and there are very few papers that I've come across. But in the last week, somebody sent me this list used by AI or gathered by AI of references on archaeoastronomy sites in Northeast America. And I had never heard of any of these, but if you look at some of the names of these studies, and these are academic studies published in peer-reviewed journals going back to the 70s, and you've got geometry of landscape and reconstructed astronomy at sites in southern New England, sunrise and sunset observations by northern Iroquois, and it goes on and on. Celestial alignments among Native American ceremonial structures in upstate New York. I particularly like that one, 2003. Cardinal directions, there's just, there were 19 of them. And I haven't read them all. I haven't downloaded them all. I just got this information. But to me, this makes the case. AI makes the case that ceremonial landscapes and these types of constructions in the Northeast must be recognized. They've been studied. It's it's not an open question. So more and more, here they are. Our archaeoastronomical orientations are prehistoric structures in Western Rhode Island. We have them here, folks. And just because, they're not officially recognized, they should be given consideration. And they are important resources of cultural significance that need to be recognized. We're wrapping up here. There's a whole set of tools that have come around to help study these things, such as 3D LiDAR scanning, GIS geopositioning, and archaeoastronomy software programs that allow it to all be married together for a high-end analysis that helps confirm these things for what they are. With that said, I want to point folks to the Overlook Mountain Center website. If folks want to take a tour of some of these sites, just contact me through this site or my email. Feel free to make a donation if you are so moved. NERA has 2 conferences a year, including one coming up at the end of April. If this stuff really trips your trigger, you might want to go down to Matamoros, which is just a little ways down 209, to catch this conference. There will be some really great speakers there on this subject. My publisher would be upset if I didn't mention my books again real quick, Spirits in Stone. These 2 that came out about 10 and 12 years ago were really just a compilation of essays exploring the research into evolution of human consciousness, civilization, and technology. And really, the common denominator between a lot of this research is the precession of the equinox. And if you were to look into that a little more, I think you'd be very, very surprised. And that is it. I'm call it a wrap. I thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing, and let's see if there are questions that.
Thank you, Glenn. Yes, anyone who has a question at this point, you're free to unmute yourself or send a question through chat. Glenn, I think there are a few questions here. Have you tried AMS 14 dating? I guess is that carbon dating or type
carbon 14? I think there's a good point to be made about carbon 14 dating, because a lot of the experts like Joe Diamond don't want to accept OSL dating on themselves by themselves. So having a carbon 14 date that lines up with an OSL date is a very important part of this process to getting OSL fully accepted by the academic community. And they don't question the date, they question the methodology with how the samples were collected, because that's really the weak link. If it's not collected correctly, then the dates don't mean anything. So the methodology is it has to have integrity, and the way you can check the OSL is through a carbon 14 corresponding date, and there have been quite a bit of that done already. So the confidence in OSL is gaining steam. I see there's another one you mentioned near the end that Dr. Diamond did not believe indigenous archaeological evidence. Yes, that is Joe Diamond from SUNY New Paltz. Him and I go back many years on butting heads on this, but again, there are many archaeologists in New York State, from Nina Versace, who's the head of the public program at Binghamton State University, to Lori Rush, who I mentioned earlier, up at Fort Drum, to Susan Sweeney at the New York State Museum. They all understand that these are important resources that need to be identified and protected. What else do we have here? Do you have a graphic of the other sites on Long Island? Oh, I'm glitching out here. Sorry about that. Okay. I don't have, there is some research on burial grounds in Long Island, and the Shinnecock are the tribe that are out there that have a large reservation. And there are some nonprofits that work with them on ceremonial landscapes, but I don't particularly have a graphic of Long Island showing all those sites. Let me see, any other questions you can see there, Riley? Michael McDonough, an architect in Stone Ridge, on his farm, claims to have found cairns. Thank you. Whoever, you know what, this gentleman, Michael McDonough, contacted me a couple of years ago, and I lost his contact, and it's been driving me crazy because he sent me a bunch of information, and I don't know if he's on the, I don't know if he's on it or not, but whoever knows him, please have him reach back out to me. I wanted to share his information with Evan Pritchard, who is in on this research as well, and very instrumental in getting these sites recognized in their proper cultural context. So I do want to get in touch with this Michael McDonough, and yeah, so that's really wonderful that that name came back to me, and I believe he's got some important features there. It's one of my.
Let's see, you have a question about the significance of snake in Lenape culture.
The serpent would have been a representation of an underworld creature, not always malevolent, as in Christian mythology, sometimes good, sometimes bad, depending on its function. But they do have the serpent, and the snake is sometimes known as the underwater serpent, or even sometimes the underwater or the feathered serpent, and also the underwater or feathered panther is actually a snake. So there are a lot of mythologies of the Algonquin that are referred to snakes as important mythological creatures and spiritual creatures, not just mythological. To them, it's spiritual. If you're using a wall as one of the points on Draco map, what leads you to choose one point or another for your star point reference? Okay, so I don't know if you caught that, but there are many dozens of sites of features on Lewis Hollow and Overlook, but there are only 8 that are very large. I agree, if you were to take those 46 or 50 or however many features, you could draw all kinds of patterns and geometric shapes. But taking just those 8 large features and connecting them in the only way possible really created that kind of S configuration that formed the petriform on the ground. I call it a component petriform because it's not all connected, but it's in separate pieces. But when you connect the pieces, you have the petriform that appears to mirror Draco in the sky. I'm hoping they'll be able to make a recording of this and make it available on the website. I believe they will. They've done that in the past. And there's also other talks of mine that you can find if you Google YouTube. Draco is a fairly dim constellation that is one of the Western, and one that is of Western construct, collection of stars. Otherwise, in the sky is random. I'm not sure I'm understanding the question. It is, when you say a Western construct, I'm not quite sure if I think you might mean like Western civilization, Greek, but the Chinese also recognized Draco. They didn't necessarily call it Draco, but they recognized that constellation in the circumpolar location high in the sky, never dropping below the horizon, and saw it as a serpent or a snake. Have you found any cairns indigenous along Route 28 between West Hurley and Andes? Yes, quite a few actually in the hollows. Serpents and snakes and turtles. So where the gateway of the scenic byway is actually by Ontario Lake, and there are sites on the Ontario Lake property. They're in my book. They're in the outback. You kind of have to go. There's a loop and then a loop off the loop. But back there are some boulders that do align with solstices, and they're not so big that they couldn't have been moved or arranged into the configuration that they are. So I have documented sites along 28 in that region. Yes, that stone, 25 tons is about what I estimated. I think between 20 and 30 tons. So whoever, oh yeah, Riley, good guess, good guesstimate there. Gleam of light reminds me of Journey to the Center of the Earth. I like that visual. Could some of these large stones be glacier erratics? I do believe many of them are, but that doesn't preclude that even after the glaciers moved them around, people, for the past 10 or 12,000 years may have encountered them and manipulated or exploited them in some way to help express their belief system. I think that's quite possible. Um, Colonial farm stone walls were usually constructed from rocks that were cleared from the farm and pasture lands. If they were piles of stone already there, they would most likely have left them. This is an interesting point, Harv, because when we find them in conjunction, and we do find almost all of the stone cairn sites, the Manitou Hanashat sites, also have stone walls associated with the piles. So to me, it makes the case that they were contemporaneous. They were built around the same time because, as you say, as you point out, or what I would point out is if you were going to build a wall and there were a bunch of stone piles right there, why wouldn't you scavenge from those stone piles to build your wall, and vice versa? If you wanted to build a bunch of stone piles and there was a stone wall lying right there nearby, why wouldn't you take the stones in that wall and use them to build your stone pile? So to me, there's an argument to be made that when they're in association, they could potentially be contemporaneously built, and also that the walls represent an enclosure of a sacred precinct. So, one would not have been disturbed, but would have been built in conjunction with the other. I hope I answered that.
Glenn, I want to ask you a follow-up on that, because that was kind of one of my questions about the cannibalization of the cairns if colonists were putting up walls, because the stones are just sitting right there. And you cited earlier that the colonists had disdain for the native peoples, calling them devils, devil this and that. And so I can't imagine them having much concern about the cairns, etc.
Well, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
If the walls were built by indigenous peoples, that seems almost antithetical to the belief that native peoples didn't believe in walls or enclosing spaces, that everything was much. You were talking about they didn't see streams as boundaries. They saw things more open. So I'm not sure I follow on why they would even be building walls to begin with.
Well, if you look into it, there actually is quite a bit of evidence that shows Native Americans building orthogonal walls, or walls that meet at 90-degree angles. It's much more documented in the southwestern U.S. culture, but there are many places where there are stone walls that meet at 90-degree angles that are Native American, and it's well established. Not well established in our area, but the researchers who have established it elsewhere are quick to note that you can't dismiss a 90-degree wall as European just because Europeans built 90-degree walls. Native Americans did that as well. So
I'm being very specific to the Munsee and the areas of the Northeast, which is very different than the Southwest, which didn't have the same kind of forest cover, and so they use stones more extensively. But I'm just posing the question about walls. Why would they have built such an extensive wall network if they weren't using it for keeping cattle in or something like that, like the colonists would have? It's quite an extensive architecture to be putting out there. So it's a question.
No, and it's a good question, and it's a fair point. But what I will point to is an 1880 U.S. census that identified in the Northeast, and this was a part of what they call the Stone Fence Survey, the 1880 census, and you can look this up. They identified over 240,000 miles of stone walls in the Northeast. So think about that. That's enough stone walls to wrap around the Earth 10 times or to go to the moon. 240,000 miles of stone walls. So for them to all been built in, say, the 200 years from say 1680 to 1880, there wasn't enough of a wall building population to do this. And in fact, because of that, Native Americans were employed, sometimes indentured, to build walls for colonists and for settlers. But there's a tremendous amount of stonework that was done by the colonists and early Americans, but there, for that amount to have been built, I think, some of it must have been pre-existing before they arrived. And in New England, not so much is well documented here in New York, there is a tradition of Native Americans building stone walls. They built them for weirs in rivers and streams to corral fish, something again that archaeologists are willing to accept, but they won't go the next step to say they built walls for ceremonial purposes. Hope that answers great.
Sure. I mean, it's fascinating. Does anyone else have any other questions? We've had quite a turnout, and everyone stuck around for the entirety. So Glenn, you definitely hit a sweet spot and tapped into some real interest by the community in this subject matter. Were there any other questions near the earlier part of these chats?
Keep going up here. I do want to just say, because I do want to, okay, this is where you were asking me to make the screen bigger. I want to just mention the Native American views on these sites, because what it means to them, and I can't speak for them, but I have been out in the woods with natives and tribal preservation officers and folks who you know, and what they'll tell you is it's about balance and harmony. And these sites are supposed to represent balance and harmony between humans and between nature and between the universe. And we're very much out of balance now because we have a tremendous disconnect from nature and the natural world. And you know, you can say be in balance and be in harmony, but what does that really mean? And balance, you know, you can't be in harmony without being in balance. And if you are literally leaning, you know, to be out of balance means you're standing and you start leaning, you know, too far to the left, too far to the right, too far forward, too far back, keep leaning and you get out of balance to the point where you might fall over. So to me, that represents, you know, the need to be centered, to not be too extreme one way or the other. And if you want to have harmony with the world and with your fellow humans, don't get too far way out to the left or to the right, because you're in risk of being out of balance and toppling over. And I think there's an important lesson in our modern world to understand being in balance and not too far to one side or the other. And that's my final thought, unless there's more questions.
That's wonderful, wonderful.
And I do want to thank everyone for sticking with it and hearing me out and your questions as well.
Okay. Well, thank you, Glenn, for a fascinating presentation. We're most appreciative of your time and commitment to researching such an interesting and really important part of Hurley's history. And thank you, everyone, for your attendance and turning out this evening. Our next presentation will be March 23rd online at 7 o'clock, and our presenter will be Susan Ingold Lewis. She's a professor emerita in history and a former affiliate faculty member of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at SUNY New Paltz. The subject will be Imagining Colonial Women in the Hudson Valley. A little blurb about it is the term colonial women conjures up visions of quaintly dressed women of European extraction going about their daily domestic chores like churning butter or hanging over a fireplace, stew pot. But the women who lived in what would someday become New York State were a diverse group in terms of race, culture, religion, national background, and socioeconomic class. New York's colonial women ranged from indigenous people to those of Western European descent, Dutch, English, French, Belgium, and German, among others, from religious refugees to enslaved Africans to capitalists. As in all periods, age and marital status also created diversity among women. Beginning with an overview of the colonial New York, this talk will focus on the many ways in which women shaped the history of the Hudson Valley between 1609 and 1775. We will end with a short addendum on New York women's experiences in the American Revolution. Thank you, everyone, and have a fantastic evening. Again, thank you, Glenn, for a fabulous presentation.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Riley.
Ciao.
Have a good evening.